Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Spectre here for another edition of Midnight Rider. Good to have you aboard. Slight technical difficulties getting things going here, but it appears we got things working behind the scenes here, so glad to have you aboard. Tonight, we're going to pick up where we left off on the book, The Virtue of Selfishness by Ayn Rand. We've been reading through that, got through chapter 4 last we met. So, stick around. I'll see you back here on the other side. Media platforms may be hazardous to your censorship kills. Pain coming. This has been a PSA by Breaking Spectre. Alright, welcome back everybody. Like I said, tonight we're going to continue on with the virtue of selfishness here. But before I do, I want to thank everybody for joining, whatever platform you may be on. We've got YouTube up, we've got Twitch up, we've got DLive up. We are over on the Tiger Network. Hello to our friends over there. And in case you need a backup platform or two, we are up over on Trovo Live as well as Vaughn Live as well. So you may want to get an account created over there should something happen. Tell your friends, family, neighbors, dog, whatever. Get them all in here, gather around. And anyway, we'll get after it. And by the way, in case you missed it, this morning we had a broadcast as well. That is now up on Gab TV as well as the old archive channel over on YouTube. And you can still find that on my channel here on the YouTube side as well. That being said, let's just jump right in. Tonight, like I said, you can follow along with the book here, if you so desire, The Virtue of Selfishness, the 50th anniversary edition from November 1st, 1964. That is what I am reading from, and tonight we will pick up on Chapter 5. Isn't everyone selfish? I believe that is where we left off last, and that is exactly where we will pick up tonight. We'll see how far we get. We may get through 3 or 4 chapters here tonight. Just depends on how the old voice holds up, so stick around. We'll see. There we go with the old whistle here just before, and let's get after it. So we'll jump up to page 53 quick here. There we go. Isn't everyone selfish? This one of the essays is part of this book by Nathaniel Branden, who she co-authored this book with. Says, some variety of this question is often raised as an objection to those who advocate an ethics of rational self-interest. For example, it is sometimes claimed everyone does what he really wants to do, otherwise he wouldn't do it. Or, no one ever really sacrifices himself, since every purposeful action is motivated by some value or goal that the actor desires. One always acts selfishly, whether one knows it or not. To untangle the intellectual confusion involved in this viewpoint, let us consider what facts of reality give rise to such an issue as selfishness versus self-sacrifice, or egoism versus altruism, and what the concept of selfishness means and entails. The issue of selfishness versus self-sacrifice arises in an ethical context. Ethics is a code of values to guide man's choices and actions. The choices and actions that determine the purpose and course of his life. In choosing his actions and goals, man faces constant alternatives. In order to choose, he requires a standard of value, a purpose which his actions are to serve or at which they are to aim. Value presupposes an answer to the question of what of value to whom and for what? And of course you can see some of that in Atlas Shrugged. It says, what is to be the goal or purpose of a man's actions? Who is to be the intended beneficiary of his actions? Is he to hold as his primary moral purpose the achievement of his own life and happiness? Or should his primary moral purpose be to serve the wishes and needs of others? The clash between egoism and altruism lies in their conflicting answers to these questions. Egoism holds that man is an end in himself. Altruism holds that man is a means to the ends of others. Egoism holds that, morally, the beneficiary of an action should be the person who acts. Altruism holds that, morally, the beneficiary of an action should be someone other than the person who acts. To be selfish is to be motivated by concern for one's self-interest. This requires that one consider what constitutes one's self-interest and how to achieve it, what values and goals to pursue, what principles and policies to adopt. If a man were not concerned with this question, he could not be said objectively to be concerned with or to desire his self-interest. One cannot be concerned with or desire that of which one has no knowledge. Selfishness entails A. A hierarchy of values set by the standard of one's self-interest, and B. The refusal to sacrifice a higher value to a lower one or to a non-value. A genuinely selfish man knows that only reason can determine what is, in fact, to his self-interest, that to pursue contradictions or attempt to act in defiance of the facts of reality is self-destructive, and self-destruction is not to his self-interest. To think is to man's self-interest, to suspend his consciousness is not. To choose his goals in the full context of his knowledge, his values, and his life is to man's self-interest. To act on the impulse of the moment without regard for his long-range context is not. To exist as a productive being is to man's self-interest. To attempt to exist as a parasite is not. To seek the life proper to his nature is to man's self-interest. To seek to live as an animal is not. Because a genuinely selfish man chooses his goals by the guidance of reason, and because the interests of rational men do not clash, other men may often benefit from his actions. But the benefit of other men is not his primary purpose or goal. His own benefit is his primary purpose and the conscious goal directing his actions. To make this principle fully clear, let us consider an extreme example of an action which, in fact, is selfish, but which conventionally might be called self-sacrificial, a man's willingness to die to save the life of the woman he loves. In what way would such a man be the beneficiary of his action? The answer is given in Atlas Shrugged, in the scene when Galt, knowing he is about to be arrested, tells Dagny, "If they get the slightest suspicion of what we are to each other, they will have you on a torture rack. I mean physical torture, before my eyes, in less than a week. I am not going to wait for that. At the first mention of a threat to you, I will kill myself and stop them right there. I don't have to tell you that if I do it, it won't be an act of self-sacrifice. I do not care to live on their terms. I do not care to obey them, and I do not care to see you enduring a drawn-out murder. There will be no values for me to seek after that, and I do not care to exist without values. If a man loves a woman so much that he does not wish to survive her death, if life can have nothing more to offer him at that price, then his dying to save her is not a sacrifice. The same principle applies to a man caught in a dictatorship, who willingly risks death to achieve freedom. To call his act a self-sacrifice, one would have to assume that he preferred to live as a slave. The selfishness of a man who is willing to die, if necessary, fighting for his freedom, lies in the fact that he is unwilling to go on living in a world where he is no longer able to act on his own judgment. That is, a world where human conditions of existence are no longer possible to him. The selfishness or unselfishness of an action is to be determined objectively. It is not determined by the feelings of the person who acts. Just as feelings are not a tool of cognition, so they are not a criterion in ethics. Obviously, in order to act, one has to be moved by some personal motive. One has to want, in some sense, to perform the action. The issue of an action's selfishness or unselfishness depends not on whether or not one wants to perform it, but on why one wants to perform it. By what standard was the action chosen? To achieve what goal? If a man proclaimed that he felt he would best benefit others by robbing and murdering them, men would not be willing to grant that his actions were altruistic. By the same logic, and for the same reasons, if a man pursues a course of blind destruction, his feeling that he has something to gain by it does not establish his actions as selfish. If, motivated solely by a sense of charity, compassion, duty, or altruism, a person renounces a value, desire, or goal in favor of the pleasure, wishes, or deeds of another person whom he values less than the thing he renounced, that is an act of self-sacrifice. The fact that a person may feel that he wants to do it does not make his action selfish or establish objectively that he is its beneficiary. Suppose, for example, that a son chooses the career he wants by rational standards, but then renounces it in order to please his mother, who prefers that he pursue a different career, one that will have more prestige in the eyes of his neighbors. The boy accedes to his mother's wish because he has accepted that such is his moral duty. He believes that his duty as a son consists of placing his mother's happiness above his own, even if he knows that his mother's demand is irrational, and even if he knows that he is sentencing himself to a life of misery and frustration. It is absurd for the advocates of the everyone is selfish doctrine to assert that since the boy is motivated by the desire to be virtuous or to avoid guilt, no self-sacrifice is involved and his action is really selfish. What is evaded is the question of why the boy feels and desires as he does. Emotions and desires are not causeless, irreducible primaries. They are the product of the premises one has accepted. The boy wants to renounce his career only because he has accepted the ethics of altruism. He believes that it is immoral to act for his self-interest. That is the principle directing his actions. Advocates of the everyone is selfish doctrine do not deny that, under the pressure of the altruist ethics, men can knowingly act against their own long-range happiness. They merely assert that in some higher, undefinable sense, such men are still acting selfishly. A definition of selfishness that includes or permits the possibility of knowingly acting against one's long-range happiness is a contradiction in terms. It is only the legacy of mysticism that permits men to imagine that they are still speaking meaningfully when they declare that one can seek one's happiness in the renunciation of one's happiness. The basic fallacy in the everyone is selfish argument consists of an extraordinarily crude equivocation. It is a psychological truism, a tautology, that all purposeful behavior is motivated. But to equate motivated behavior with selfish behavior is to blank out the distinction between an elementary fact of human psychology and the phenomenon of ethical choice. It is to evade the central problem of ethics, namely, by what is man to be motivated? A genuine selfishness, that is, a genuine concern with discovering what is to one's self-interest, an acceptance of the responsibility of achieving it, a refusal ever to betray it by acting on the blind whim, mood, impulse, or feeling of the moment, an uncompromising loyalty to one's judgment, convictions, and values, represents a profound moral achievement. Those who assert that everyone is selfish commonly intend their statement as an expression of cynicism and contempt. But the truth is that their statement pays mankind a compliment it does not deserve. Very interesting. Quite the conundrum, right? that penned back in September 1962. Lots to ponder there. And as we move on to Chapter 6, we'll get into the psychology of pleasure, another essay by Nathaniel Branden here. It says, pleasure for man is not a luxury, but a profound psychological need. Pleasure, in the widest sense of the term, is a metaphysical concomitant of life, the reward and consequence of successful action, just as pain is the insignia of failure, destruction, death. Through the state of enjoyment, man experiences the value of life, the sense that life is worth living, worth struggling to maintain. In order to live, man must act to achieve values. Pleasure or enjoyment is at once an emotional payment for successful action and an incentive to continue acting. Further, because of the metaphysical meaning of pleasure to man, the state of enjoyment gives him a direct experience of his own efficacy, of his competence to deal with the facts of reality, to achieve his values, to live. Implicitly contained in the experience of pleasure is the feeling, I am in control of my existence, just as implicitly contained in the experience of pain is the feeling, I am helpless. As pleasure emotionally entails a sense of efficacy, so pain emotionally entails a sense of impotence. Thus, in letting man experience, in his own person, the sense that life is a value and that he is a value, pleasure serves as the emotional fuel of man's existence. Just as the pleasure-pain mechanism of man's body works as a barometer of health or injury, so the pleasure-pain mechanism of his consciousness works on the same principle, acting as a barometer of what is for him or against him, what is beneficial to his life or inimical. But man is a being of volitional consciousness. He has no innate ideas, no automatic or infallible knowledge of what his survival depends on. He must choose the values that are to guide his actions and set his goals. His emotional mechanism will work according to the kind of values he chooses. It is his values that determine what a man feels to be for him or against him. It is his values that determine what a man seeks for pleasure. If a man makes an error in his choice of values, his emotional mechanism will not correct him. It has no will of its own. If a man's values are such that he desires things which, in fact and in reality, lead to his destruction, his emotional mechanism will not save him, but will, instead, urge him on toward destruction. He will have set it in reverse against himself and against the facts of reality, against his own life. Man's emotional mechanism is like an electronic computer. Man has the power to program it, but no power to change its nature. So that if he sets the wrong programming, he will not be able to escape the fact that the most self-destructive desires will have, for him, the emotional intensity and urgency of life-saving actions. He has, of course, the power to change the programming, but only by changing his values. A man's basic values reflect his conscious or subconscious view of himself and of existence. They are the expression of A, the degree and nature of his self-esteem, or lack of it, and B, the extent to which he regards the universe as open to his understanding and action or closed, in effect the extent to which he holds a benevolent or malevolent view of existence. Thus, the things which a man seeks for pleasure or enjoyment are profoundly revealing psychologically. They are the index of his character and soul. And by soul, I mean a man's consciousness and his basic motivating values. There are, broadly, 5 interconnected areas that allow man to experience the enjoyment of life: productive work, human relationships, recreation, art, and sex. Productive work is the most fundamental of these. Through his work, man gains his basic sense of control over existence, his sense of efficacy, which is a necessary foundation of the ability to enjoy any other value. The man whose life lacks direction or purpose, the man has no creative goal, necessarily feels helpless and out of control. The man who feels helpless and out of control feels inadequate to and unfit for existence. and the man who feels unfit for existence is incapable of enjoying it. One of the hallmarks of a man of self-esteem who regards the universe as open to his effort is the profound pleasure he experiences in the productive work of his mind. His enjoyment of life is fed by his unceasing concern to grow in knowledge and ability, to think, to achieve, to move forward, to meet new challenges and overcome them, to earn the pride of a constantly expanding efficacy. A different kind of soul is revealed by the man who predominantly takes pleasure in working only at the routine and familiar, who is inclined to enjoy working in a semi-daze, who sees happiness and freedom from challenge or struggle or effort. The soul of a man profoundly deficient in self-esteem, to whom the universe appears an unknowable and vaguely threatening, the man whose central motivating impulse is a longing for safety, not the safety that is won by efficacy, but the safety of a world in which efficacy is not demanded. Still, a different kind of soul is revealed by the man who finds it inconceivable that work, any form of work, can be enjoyable, who regards the effort of earning a living as a necessary evil, who dreams only of the pleasures that begin when the workday ends, the pleasure of drowning his brain in alcohol or television or billiards or women, the pleasure of not being conscious, the soul of a man with scarcely a shred of self-esteem, who never expected the universe to be comprehensible and takes his lethargic dread of it for granted, and whose only form of relief and only notion of enjoyment is a dim flicker of undemanding sensations. Still, another kind of soul is revealed by the man who takes pleasure, not in achievement, but in destruction, whose action is aimed not at attaining efficacy, but at ruling those who have attained it. The soul of a man so abjectly lacking in self-value, and so overwhelmed by terror of existence, that his sole form of self-fulfillment is to unleash his resentment and hatred against those who do not share his state, those who are able to live, as if, by destroying the confident, the strong, and the healthy, he could convert impotence into efficacy. A rational, self-confident man is motivated by a love of values and by a desire to achieve them. A neurotic is motivated by fear and by a desire to escape it. This difference in motivation is reflected not only in the things each type of man will seek for pleasure, but in the nature of the pleasure they will experience. The emotional quality of the pleasure experienced by the four men described above, for instance, is not the same. The quality of any pleasure depends on the mental processes that give rise to and attend it, and on the nature of the values involved. The pleasure of using one's consciousness properly and the pleasure of being unconscious are not the same. Just as the pleasure of achieving real values, of gaining an authentic sense of efficacy, and the pleasure of temporarily diminishing one's sense of fear and helplessness are not the same. The man of self-esteem experiences the pure, unadulterated enjoyment of using his faculties properly, and of achieving actual values in reality, a pleasure of which the other three men can have no inkling, just as he has no inkling of the dim, murky state which they call pleasure. The same principle applies to all forms of enjoyment. Thus, in the realm of human relationships, a different form of pleasure is experienced, a different sort of motivation is involved, and a different kind of character is revealed by the man who seeks for enjoyment the company of human beings of intelligence, integrity, and self-esteem, who share his exacting standards, and by the man who is able to enjoy himself only with human beings, who have no standards whatever, and with whom, therefore, he feels free to be himself, or by the man who finds pleasure only in the company of people he despises, to whom he can compare himself favorably, or by the man who finds pleasure only among people he can deceive and manipulate, from whom he derives the lowest neurotic substitute for a sense of genuine efficacy, a sense of power. For the rational, psychologically healthy man, the desire for pleasure is the desire to celebrate his control over reality. For the neurotic, The desire for pleasure is the desire to escape from reality. Now, consider the sphere of recreation. For instance, a party. A rational man enjoys a party as an emotional reward for achievement, and he can enjoy it only if, in fact, it involves activities that are enjoyable, such as seeing people whom he likes, meeting new people whom he finds interesting, engaging in conversations in which something worth saying and hearing is being said and heard. But a neurotic can enjoy a party for reasons unrelated to the real activities taking place. He may hate or despise or fear all the people present. He may act like a noisy fool and feel secretly ashamed of it. But he will feel that he is enjoying it all, because people are emitting the vibrations of approval, or because it is a social distinction to have been invited to this party, or because other people appear to be gay, or because a party has spared him, for the length of an evening, the air of being alone. Or the terror of being alone, I should say. The pleasure of being drunk is obviously the pleasure of escaping from the responsibility of consciousness. And so are the kind of social gatherings held for no other purpose than the expression of hysterical chaos, where the guests wander around in an alcoholic stupor, prattling noisily and senselessly, and enjoying the illusion of a universe where one is not burdened with purpose, logic, reality, or awareness. Observe in this connection the modern beatniks, for instance, their manner of dancing. What one sees is not smiles of authentic enjoyment, but the vacant, staring eyes, the jerky, disorganized movements of what looks like decentralized bodies, all working very hard, with a kind of flat-footed hysteria, but projecting an air of the purposeless, the senseless, the mindless. This is the pleasure of unconsciousness. Or consider the quieter kind of pleasures that fill many people's lives: family picnics, ladies' parties, or coffee clatches, charity bazaars, vegetative kinds of vacation, all of them occasions of quiet boredom for all concerned, in which the boredom is the value. Boredom to such people means safety, the known, the usual, the routine, the absence of the new, the exciting, the unfamiliar, the demanding. What is a demanding pleasure? A pleasure that demands the use of one's mind, not in the sense of problem-solving, but in the sense of exercising discrimination, judgment, awareness. One of the cardinal pleasures of life is offered to man by works of art. Art at its highest potential, as a projection of things, as they might be and ought to be, can provide man with an invaluable emotional fuel. But, again, the kind of artworks one responds to depends on one's deepest values and premises. A man can seek the projection of the heroic, the intelligent, the efficacious, the dramatic, the purposeful, the stylized, the ingenious, the challenging. He can seek the pleasures of admiration, of looking up to great values, or he can seek the satisfaction of contemplating gossip column variants of the folks next door, with nothing demanded of him, neither in thought nor in value standards. He can feel himself pleasantly warmed by projections of the known and unfamiliar, seeking to feel a little less of a stranger and afraid in a world he never made. Or his soul can vibrate affirmatively to projections of horror and human degradation. He can feel gratified by the thought that he's not as bad as the dope-addicted dwarf or the crippled lesbian he's reading about. He can relish in art which tells him that man is evil, that reality is unknowable, that existence is unendurable, that no one can help anything, that his secret terror is normal. Art projects an implicit view of existence, and it is one's own view of existence that determines the art will one respond to. The soul of the man whose favorable play is Cyrano de Bergerac is radically different from the soul of the man whose favorite play is Waiting for Godot. Of the various pleasures that man can offer himself, the greatest is pride. The pleasure he takes in his own achievements and in the creation of his own character. The pleasure he takes in the character and achievements of another human being is that of admiration. The highest expression of the most intense union of these two responses, pride and admiration, is romantic love. Its celebration is sex. It is in this sphere, above all, in a man's romantic sexual responses, that his view of himself and of existence stands eloquently revealed. A man falls in love with and sexually desires a person who reflects his own deepest values. There are two crucial respects in which a man's romantic sexual responses are psychologically revealing: in his choice of partner and in the meaning to him of the sexual act. A man of self-esteem, a man in love with himself and with life, feels an intense need to find human beings he can admire, to find a spiritual equal whom he can love. The quality that will attract him most is self-esteem. Self-esteem and an unclouded sense of the value of existence. To such a man, sex is an act of celebration. Its meaning is a tribute to himself and to the woman he has chosen, the ultimate form of experiencing concretely and in his own person the value and joy of being alive. The need for such an experience is inherent in man's nature. But if a man lacks the self-esteem to earn it, he attempts to fake it. And he chooses his partner subconsciously by the standard of her ability to help him fake it, to give him the illusion of a self-value he does not possess, and of a happiness he does not feel. Thus, if a man is attracted to a woman of intelligence, confidence, and strength, if he is attracted to a heroine, he reveals one kind of soul. If, instead, he is attracted to an irresponsible, helpless scatterbrain, whose weakness enables him to feel masculine, he reveals another kind of soul. If he is attracted to a frightened slut whose lack of judgment and standards allows him to feel free of reproach, he reveals another kind of soul. The same principle, of course, applies to a woman's romantic sexual choices. The sexual act has a different meaning for the person whose desire is fed by pride and admiration, to whom the pleasurable self-experience it affords is an end in itself, and for the person who seeks in sex the proof of masculinity or femininity, or the amelioration of despair, or a defense against anxiety, or an escape from boredom. Paradoxically, it is the so-called pleasure chasers, the men who seemingly live for nothing but the sensation of the moment, who are concerned only with having a good time, who are psychologically incapable of enjoying pleasure as an end in itself. The neurotic pleasure chaser imagines that, by going through the motions of a celebration, he will be able to make himself feel that he has something to celebrate. One of the hallmarks of the man who lacks self-esteem, and the real punishment for his moral and psychological default, is the fact that all his pleasures are pleasures of escape from the two pursuers whom he has betrayed, and from whom there is no escape: reality and his own mind. Since the function of pleasure is to afford man a sense of his own efficacy, the neurotic is caught in a deadly conflict. He is compelled by his nature as man to feel a desperate need for pleasure, as a confirmation and expression of his control over reality. But he can find pleasure only in an escape from reality. That is the reason why his pleasures do not work, why they bring him not a sense of pride, fulfillment, inspiration, but a sense of guilt, frustration, hopelessness, shame. The effect of pleasure on a man of self-esteem is that of a reward and a confirmation. The effect of pleasure on a man who lacks self-esteem is that of a threat, the threat of anxiety, the shaking of the precarious foundation of his pseudo-self-value, the sharpening of his ever-present fear that the structure will collapse, and he will find himself face to face with a stern, absolute, unknown, and unforgiving reality. One of the commonest complaints of patients who seek psychotherapy is that nothing has the power to give them pleasure, that authentic enjoyment seems impossible to them. This is the inevitable dead end of the policy of pleasure as escape. To preserve an unclouded capacity for the enjoyment of life is an unusual moral and psychological achievement. Contrary to popular belief, it is the prerogative, not of mindlessness, but of an unremitting devotion to the act of perceiving reality, and of a scrupulous intellectual integrity. It is the reward of self-esteem. February 1964, that was penned. Very interesting. Look at the different types of souls, right? And of course, perhaps you can depict which side the typical politicians, the panderers, the folks of those types are versus perhaps somebody that's a little more sane, right? Very interesting. All right, into chapter 7. Doesn't life require compromise? So a compromise is an adjustment of conflicting claims by mutual concessions. This means that both parties to a compromise have some valid claim and some value to each other, to offer each other. And this means that both parties agree upon some fundamental principle which serves as a base for their deal. It is only in regard to concretes or particulars, implementing a mutually accepted basic principle, that one may compromise. For instance, one may bargain with a buyer over the price one wants to receive for one's product, and agree on a sum somewhere between one's demand and his offer. The mutually accepted basic principle, in such case, is the principle of trade, namely, that the buyer must pay the seller for his product. But if one wanted to be paid, and the alleged buyer wanted to obtain one's product for nothing, no compromise, agreement, or discussion would be possible, only the total surrender of one or the other. There can be no compromise between a property owner and a burglar. Offering the burglar a single teaspoon of one's silverware would not be a compromise, but a total surrender. The recognition of his right to one's property. What value or concession did the burglar offer in return? And once the principle of unilateral concessions is accepted as the base of a relationship by both parties, it is only a matter of time before the burglar would seize the rest. As an example of this process, observe the present foreign policy of the United States. There can be no compromise between freedom and government controls. To accept just a few controls is to surrender the principle of inalienable individual rights, and to substitute for it the principle of the government's unlimited arbitrary power, thus delivering oneself into gradual enslavement. As an example of this process, observe the present domestic policy of the United States. There can be no compromise on basic principles or on fundamental issues. What would you regard as a compromise between life and death, or between truth and falsehood, or between reason and irrationality? Today, however, when people speak of compromise, what they mean is not a legitimate mutual concession or a trade, but precisely the betrayal of one's principles, the unilateral surrender to any groundless, irrational claim. The root of that doctrine is ethical subjectivism, which holds that a desire or a whim is an irreducible moral primary, that every man is entitled to any desire he might feel like asserting, that all desires have equal moral validity, and that the only way men can get along together is by giving in to anything and compromising with anyone. It is not hard to see who would profit and who would lose by such a doctrine. The immorality of this doctrine, and the reason why the term compromise implies, in today's general usage, an act of moral treason, lies in the fact that it requires men to accept ethical subjectivism as the basic principle superseding all principles in human relationships, and to sacrifice anything is a concession to one another's whims. The question, doesn't life require compromise, is usually asked by those who fail to differentiate between a basic principle and some concrete, specific wish. Accepting a lesser job than one had wanted is not a compromise. Taking orders from one's employer on how to do the work for which one is hired is not a compromise. Failing to have a cake after one has eaten it is not a compromise. Integrity does not consist of loyalty to one's subjective whims, but of loyalty to irrational principles. A compromise, in the unprincipled sense of that word, is not a breach of one's comfort, but a breach of one's convictions. A compromise does not consist of doing something one dislikes, but of doing something one knows to be evil. Accompanying one's husband or wife to a concert when one does not care for music is not a compromise. Surrendering to his or her irrational demands for social conformity, for pretended religious observance, or for generosity toward boorish in-laws is. Working for an employee or employer who does not share one's ideas is not a compromise. Pretending to share his ideas is. Accepting a publisher's suggestions to make changes in one's manuscript when one sees the rational validity of his suggestions is not a compromise. Making such changes in order to please him or to please the public against one's own judgment and standards is. The excuse given in all such cases is that the compromise is only temporary and that one will reclaim one's integrity at some indeterminate future date. But one cannot correct a husband's or wife's irrationality by giving in to it and encouraging it to grow. One cannot achieve the victory of one's ideas by helping to propagate their opposite. One cannot offer a literary masterpiece when one has become rich and famous to a following one has acquired by writing trash. If one found it difficult to maintain one's loyalty to one's own convictions at the start, a succession of betrayals which helped to augment the power of the evil one lacked the courage to fight will not make it easier at a later date, but will make it virtually impossible. There can be no compromise on moral principles. In any compromise between food and poison, it is only death that can win. In any compromise between good and evil, it is only evil that can profit. And that out of Atlas Shrugged. Says the next time you are tempted to ask, doesn't life require compromise? Translate that question into its actual meaning. Doesn't life require the surrender of that which is true and good to that which is false and evil? The answer to that precisely is what life forbids. If one wishes to achieve anything but a stretch of tortured years spent in progressive self-destruction. Stick to your convictions. Do not compromise. And chapter 8 here says, how does one lead a rational life in an irrational society? Perhaps maybe this is a bit of a guide for where we stand today. Granted, this was written back in the 60s. We'll see how this applies. It says, I will confine my answer to a single fundamental aspect of this question. I will name only one principle, the opposite of the idea, which is so prevalent today, and which is responsible for the spread of evil in the world. That principle is, one must never fail to pronounce moral judgment. Nothing can corrupt and disintegrate a culture or a man's character as thoroughly as does the precept of moral agnosticism. The idea that one must never pass moral judgment on others, that one must be morally tolerant of anything, that the good consists of never distinguishing good from evil. It is obvious who profits and who loses by such a precept. It is not justice or equal treatment that you grant to men when you abstain equally from praising men's virtues and from condemning men's vices. When your impartial attitude declares, in effect, that neither the good nor the evil may expect anything from you, whom do you betray, and whom do you encourage? But to pronounce moral judgment is an enormous responsibility. To be a judge, one must possess an unimpeachable character. One need not be omniscient or infallible, and it is not an issue of errors of knowledge. One needs an unbreached integrity, that is, the absence of an indulgence in conscious, willful evil. Just as a judge in a court of law may err when the evidence is inconclusive but may not evade the evidence available, nor accept bribes, nor allow any personal feelings, emotion, desire, or fear to obstruct his mind's judgment of the facts of reality, so every rational person must maintain an equally strict and solemn integrity in the courtroom within his own mind, where the responsibility is more awesome than in a public tribunal, because he, the judge, is the only one to know when he has been impeached. There is, however, a court of appeal from one's judgments, objective reality. A judge puts himself on trial every time he pronounces a verdict. It is only in today's reign of amoral cynicism, subjectivism, and hooliganism that men may imagine themselves free to utter any sort of irrational judgment and to suffer no consequences. But, in fact, a man is to be judged by the judgments he pronounces. The things which he condemns or extols exist in objective reality, and are open to the independent appraisal of others. It is his own moral character and standards that he reveals when he blames or praises. If he condemns America and extols Soviet Russia, or if he attacks businesses and defends juvenile delinquents, or if he denounces a great work of art and praises trash, it is the nature of his own soul that he confesses. It is their fear of this responsibility that prompts most people to adopt an attitude of indiscriminate moral neutrality. It is the fear best expressed in the precept, "Judge not, that ye be not judged." But the precept, in fact, is an abdication of moral responsibility. It is a moral blank check one gives to others in exchange for a moral blank check one expects for oneself. There is no escape from the fact that men have to make choices. So long as men have to make choices, there is no escape from moral values. So long as moral values are at stake, no moral neutrality is possible. To abstain from condemning a torturer is to become an accessory to the torture and murder of his victims. The moral principle to adopt in this issue is judge and be prepared to be judged. The opposite of moral neutrality is not a blind, arbitrary, self-righteous condemnation of any idea, action, or person that does not fit one's mood, one's memorized slogans, or one's snap judgment of the moment. An indiscriminate tolerance and indiscriminate condemnation are not two opposites. They are two variants of the same evasion. To declare that everybody is white, or everybody is black, or everybody is neither white nor black, but gray, is not a moral judgment, but an escape from the responsibility of moral judgment. To judge means to evaluate a given concrete by reference to an abstract principle or standard. It is not an easy task. It is not a task that can be performed automatically by one's feelings, instincts, or hunches. It is a task that requires the most precise, the most exacting, the most ruthlessly objective and rational process of thought. It is fairly easy to grasp abstract moral principles. It can be very difficult to apply them to a given situation, particularly when it involves the moral character of another person. When one pronounces moral judgment, whether in praise or in blame, one must be prepared to answer why, and to prove one's case, to oneself and to any rational inquirer. The policy of always pronouncing moral judgment does not mean that one must regard oneself as a missionary charged with the responsibility of saving everyone's soul, nor that one must give unsolicited moral appraisals to all those one meets. It means, A, that one must know clearly, in full, verbally identified form, one's own moral evaluation of every person, issue, and event with which one deals, and act accordingly. And B, that one must make one's moral evaluation known to others, when it is rationally appropriate to do so. This last means that one need not launch into unprovoked moral denunciations or debates, but that one must speak up in situations where silence can objectively be taken to mean agreement with or sanction of evil. When one deals with irrational persons, where argument is futile, a mere "I don't agree with you" is sufficient to negate any implication of moral sanction. When one deals with better people, a full statement of one's views may be morally required. But in no case and in no situation may one permit one's own values to be attacked or denounced and keep silent. Moral values are the motive power of a man's actions. By pronouncing moral judgment, one protects the clarity of one's own perception and the rationality of the course one chooses to pursue. It makes a difference whether one thinks that one is dealing with human errors of knowledge or with human evil. Observe how many people evade, rationalize, and drive their minds into a state of blind stupor in dread of discovering that those they deal with, their loved ones or friends or business associates or political rulers, are not merely mistaken, but evil. Observe that this dread leads them to sanction, to help, and to spread the very evil whose existence they fear to acknowledge. If people did not indulge in such abject evasions as the claim that some contemptible liar means well, that a mooching bum can't help it, that a juvenile delinquent needs love, that a criminal doesn't know any better, that a power-seeking politician is moved by patriotic concern for the public good, that communists are merely agrarian reformers, the history of the past few decades or centuries would have been different. Ask yourself why totalitarian dictatorships find it necessary to pour money and effort into propaganda for their own helpless, chain-gagged slaves who have no means of protest or defense. The answer is that even the humblest peasant or the lowest savage would rise in blind rebellion, were he to realize that he is being immolated, not to some incomprehensible, noble purpose, but to plain, naked, human evil. Observe also that moral neutrality necessitates a progressive sympathy for vice and a progressive antagonism to virtue. A man who struggles not to acknowledge that evil is evil finds it increasingly dangerous to acknowledge that the good is the good. To him, a person of virtue is a threat that can topple all of his evasions, particularly when an issue of justice is involved, which demands that he take sides. It is then that such formulas as "nobody is ever fully right or fully wrong," and "who am I to judge," take their lethal effect. The man who begins by saying, "there is some good in the worst of us," goes on to say, "there is some bad in the best of us." Then, "there's got to be some bad in the best of us," and then, "it is the best of us who make life difficult. Why don't they keep silent? Who are they to judge?" And then, on some gray, middle-aged morning, such a man realizes suddenly that he has betrayed all the values he had loved in his distant spring, and wonders how it happened, and slams his mind shut to the answer by telling himself hastily that the fear he had felt in his worst, most shameful moments was right, and that values have no chance in this world. An irrational society is a society of moral cowards, of men paralyzed by the loss of moral standards, principles, and goals. But since men have to act, so long as they live, such a society is ready to be taken over by anyone willing to set its direction. The initiative can come from only two types of men, either from the man who is willing to assume the responsibility of asserting rational values, or from the thug who is not troubled by questions of responsibility. No matter how hard the struggle, there is only one choice that a rational man can make in the face of such an alternative. That from April 1962. So again, using the judges, the things that we're seeing play out with the Floyd trial as we see it playing out right now. Can you imagine being a judge trying to go through this or being the jury, and you got the woke mobsters and whatnot laying in wait. We're going to burn this joint down if we don't get our social justice, as opposed to the facts and the rational. Insanity. But this is where we are. Chapter 9. The Cult of Moral Grayness. One of the most eloquent symptoms of the moral bankruptcy of today's culture is a certain fashionable attitude toward moral issues, best summarized as, there are no blacks and whites, there are only grays. This is asserted in regard to persons, actions, principles of conduct, and morality in general, black and white. In this context means good and evil. The reverse order used in that catchphrase is interesting psychologically. In any respect, one cares to examine that notion is full of contradictions. Foremost among them is the fallacy of the stolen concept. If there is no black and white, there can be no gray, since gray is merely a mixture of the two. Before one can identify anything as gray, one has to know what is black and what is white. In the field of morality, this means that one must first identify what is good and what is evil. And when a man has ascertained that one alternative is good and the other is evil, he has no justification for choosing a mixture. There can be no justification for choosing any part of that which one knows to be evil. In morality, black is predominantly the result of attempting to pretend to oneself that one is merely gray. If a moral code, such as altruism, is, in fact, impossible to practice, it is a code that must be condemned as black, not its victims evaluated as gray. If a moral code prescribes irreconcilable contradictions, so that by choosing the good in one respect, a man becomes evil in another, it is a code that must be rejected as black. If a moral code is inapplicable to reality, if it offers no guidance except a series of arbitrary, groundless, out-of-context injunctions and commandments, to be accepted on faith and practiced automatically, as blind dogma, its practitioners cannot properly be classified as white or black or gray. A moral code that forbids and paralyzes moral judgment is a contradiction in terms. If, in a complex moral issue, a man struggles to determine what is right and fails or makes an honest error, he cannot be regarded as gray. Morally, he is white. Errors of knowledge are not breaches of morality. No proper moral code can demand infallibility or omniscience. But if, in order to escape the responsibility of moral judgment, a man closes his eyes and mind, if he evades the facts of the issues and struggles not to know, he cannot be regarded as gray. Morally, he is as black as they come. Many forms of confusion, uncertainty, and epistemological sloppiness help to obscure the contradictions and to disguise the actual meaning of the doctrine of moral grayness. Some people believe that it is merely a restatement of such bromides, as nobody is perfect in this world. In effect, everybody is a mixture of good and evil, and, therefore, morally gray. Since the majority of those one meets are likely to fit that description, people accept it as some sort of natural fact, without further thought. They forget that morality deals only with issues open to man's choice, in effect, to his free will, and, therefore, that no statistical generalizations are valid in this matter. If man is gray, by nature, no moral concepts are applicable to him, including grayness, and no such thing as morality is possible. But if man has free will, then the fact that 10 or 10 million men made the wrong choice does not necessitate that the 11th one will make it. It necessitates nothing and proves nothing in regard to any given individual. There are many reasons why most people are morally imperfect, in effect hold mixed, contradictory premises and values. The altruist morality is one of the reasons. But that is a different issue. Regardless of the reasons of their choices, the fact that most people are morally gray does not invalidate man's need of morality and of moral whiteness. If anything, it makes the need more urgent. Nor does it warrant the epistemological package deal of dismissing the problem by consigning all men to moral grayness, and thus refusing to recognize or to practice whiteness. Nor does it serve as an escape from the responsibility of moral judgment, unless one is prepared to dispense with morality altogether, and regard a petty chiseler and a murderer as morally equal. One still has to judge and evaluate the many shadings of gray that one may encounter in the characters of individual men, and the only way to judge them is by a clearly defined criterion of black and white. A similar notion, involving similar errors, is held by some people who believe that the doctrine of moral grayness is merely a restatement of the proposition. There are two sides to every issue, which they take to mean that nobody is ever fully right or fully wrong. But that is not what the proposition means or implies. It implies only that, in judging an issue, one should take cognizance of or give a hearing to both sides. This does not mean that the claims of both sides will necessarily be equally valid, nor even that there will be some modicum of justice on both sides. More often than not, justice will be on one side, an unwarranted presumption, or worse, on the other. There are, of course, complex issues in which both sides are right in some respects, and wrong in others. And it is here that the package deal of pronouncing both sides gray is at least permissible. It is in such issues that the most rigorous precision of moral judgment is required to identify and evaluate the various aspects involved, which can be done only by unscrambling the mixed elements of black and white. The basic error in all these various confusions is the same. It consists of forgetting that morality deals only with issues open to man's choice, which means forgetting the difference between unable and unwilling. This permits people to translate the catchphrase, "there are no blacks and whites," into "men are unable to be wholly good or wholly evil," which they accept in fuzzy resignation, without questioning the metaphysical contradictions it entails. But not many people would accept it. If that catchphrase were translated into the actual meaning it is intended to smuggle into their minds, men are unwilling to be wholly good or wholly evil. The first thing one would say to any advocate of such a proposition is, "Speak for yourself, brother." And that, in effect, is what he is actually doing, consciously or subconsciously, intentionally or inadvertently. When a man declares, "there are no blacks and whites," he is making a psychological confession, and what he means is, "I am unwilling to be wholly good, and please don't regard me as wholly evil." Just as in epistemology, the cult of uncertainty is a revolt against reason, so in ethics the cult of moral grayness is a revolt against moral values. Both are a revolt against the absolutism of reality. Just as a cult of uncertainty could not succeed by an open rebellion against reason and therefore struggles to elevate the negation of reason into some sort of superior reasoning, so the cult of moral grayness could not succeed by an open rebellion against morality, and struggles to elevate the negation of morality into a superior kind of virtue. Observe the form in which one encounters that doctrine. It is seldom presented as a positive, as an ethical theory, or a subject of discussion. Predominantly, one hears it as a negative, as a snap objection or reproach, uttered in a manner implying that one is guilty of breaching an absolute so self-evident as to require no discussion. In tones ranging from astonishment to sarcasm to anger to indignation to hysterical hatred, the doctrine is thrown at you in the form of an accusatory. "Surely you don't think in terms of black and white, do you?" Prompted by confusion, helplessness, and fear of the entire subject of morality, most people hasten to answer guiltily, No, of course I don't. Without any clear idea of the nature of the accusation. They do not pause to grasp that the accusation is saying, in effect, surely you are not so unfair as to discriminate between good and evil, are you? Or surely you are not so evil as to seek the good, are you? Or surely you are not so immoral as to believe in morality. Moral guilt, fear, or moral judgment, and a plea for blanket forgiveness are so obviously the motive of that catchphrase that a glance at reality would be sufficient to tell its proponents what an ugly confession they are uttering. But escape from reality is both the precondition and the goal of the cult of moral grayness. Philosophically, that cult is a negation of morality, but psychologically, this is not its adherents' goals. What they seek is not a morality, but something more profoundly irrational, a non-absolute, fluid, elastic, middle-of-the-road morality. They do not proclaim themselves beyond good and evil. They seek to preserve the advantages of both. They are not moral challengers, nor do they represent a medieval version of flamboyant evil worshippers. What gives them their peculiar modern flavor is that they do not advocate selling one's soul to the devil. They advocate selling it piecemeal, bit by bit, to any retail bidder. They are not a philosophical school of thought. They are the typical product of philosophical default, of the intellectual bankruptcy that has produced irrationalism in epistemology, a moral vacuum in ethics, and a mixed economy in politics. A mixed economy is an immoral war of pressure groups, devoid of principles, values, or any reference to justice. A war whose ultimate weapon is the power of brute force, but whose outward form is a game of compromise. The cult of moral grayness is the ersatz morality, which made it possible, and to which men now cling in a panicky attempt to justify it. Observe that their dominant overtone is not a quest for the white, but an obsessive terror of being branded black, and with good reason. Observe that they are pleading for a morality which would hold compromise as its standard of value, and would thus make it possible to gauge virtue by the number of values one is willing to betray. The consequences and the vested interests of their doctrine are visible all around us. Observe, in politics, that the term extremism has become a synonym of evil, regardless of the content of the issue. The evil is not what you are extreme about, but that you are extreme. In effect, consistent. Observe the phenomenon of the so-called neutralists in the United Nations. The neutralists are worse than merely neutral in the conflict between the United States and Soviet Russia. They are committed, on principle, to see no difference between the two sides, never to consider the merits of an issue, and always to seek a compromise, any compromise in any conflict, as, for instance, between an aggressor and an invaded country. Observe in literature the emergence of a thing called anti-hero, whose distinction is that he possesses no distinction, no virtues, no values, no goals, no character, no significance, yet who occupies, in plays and novels, the position formerly held by a hero, with the story centered on his actions, even though he does nothing and gets nowhere. Observe that the term good guys and bad guys is used as a sneer, and, particularly in television, observe the revolt against happy endings, the demands that the bad guys be given an equal chance and an equal number of victories. Like a mixed economy, men of mixed premises may be called gray, but in both cases the mixture does not remain gray for long. Gray, in this context, is merely a prelude to black. There may be gray men, but there can be no gray moral principles. Morality is a code of black and white. When and if men attempt a compromise, it is obvious which side will necessarily lose and which will necessarily profit. Such are the reasons why, when one is asked, Surely you don't think in terms of black and white, do you? The proper answer, in essence, if not in form, should be, you're damn right, I do. June 1964. And seems like that is the making of where we see our politicians today, wafflers, right? Pretty much don't play in the white, definitely in the black, try to be in the gray, and always about compromise, isn't it? Always compromise, which means that we can expect out of both sides of the aisle we're going to get an equal screw job. And it's usually not to the good, it's to the evil. Hence why, for example, they name these bills the way they do to sound good until you actually read what is actually in them, which is 180 degrees opposite of what the title of said bills state. My thoughts, anyway. All right, well, that is going to do it for this evening. Appreciate you guys tuning in. We will pick this up here again at a later time. Got some other news net I want to try and get to here in the next couple days as well, so look for that. Otherwise, I'll be around tomorrow on the 5x5 channel at our normal time. You'll be able to catch us over there, kicking off at 3 p.m. Eastern. And so, with that being said, I'll see you guys tomorrow at that time. Take care. God bless everybody.